They sold her like a commodity, and the whole courtroom burst out laughing. Not a single man would take her, even if offered for free. But then a stranger stood up, without a word of explanation, without a question, simply signed his name, cut the ropes from her wrists, and walked out. This is the story of the woman the world called useless, and the only man brave enough to see the truth. If you're watching this far, please like and comment with your city name. I want to know how far this story has come. The rope around Maeve Callahan's wrists had been tied by her uncle's hands, and that fact alone told her everything she needed to know about how the morning was going to go. She stood in the center of Harwick's territorial courthouse, if you could call it that. It was really just a converted feed warehouse with a judge's bench hammered together from barn planks, and a smell that hadn't decided whether it was more sawdust or livestock. The November light came in gray and mean through two high windows, and the dozen or so men seated on rough benches turned to look at her the way men looked at livestock being walked to auction. Which was, she understood now, exactly what this was. Her uncle, Clement Callahan, stood off to the side with his hat in his hands and his eyes aimed somewhere past her left shoulder. He was a narrow man with a drinker's nose and the permanently surprised expression of someone life kept disappointing, despite his best efforts to avoid earning anything. He'd been gambling at Purdy's back room for 3 nights running, and somewhere around the second night, when the cards stopped cooperating, he'd put up the only thing he had left. Her. She was 23 years old. She was large, not soft large, but big-boned and broad-shouldered, the kind of build that made dresses sit wrong and chairs feel uncertain. She'd heard every variation of what people thought about that, since she was old enough to understand words. Built like a draft horse. More woman than any man needs. You'd need 2 men to carry her out of a burning building. She'd stopped flinching at most of it by the time she was 15. The flinching just gave people something to aim at. "Gentlemen," said Judge Orrin Hatch, who was about 60 and looked like something left out in the rain for several decades. "We have before us a matter of debt settlement under territorial provision. 12, Section 4. The debt holder, Mr. Clement Callahan, offers the transfer of custodial obligation for his niece, Miss Maeve Callahan, as full satisfaction of monies owed to the assembled creditors." He adjusted his spectacles and peered over them at the room. "Any taker assumes full legal responsibility and receives full legal claim. Documents are prepared. We'll proceed." There was a pause that stretched longer than it should have. "How much is the debt?" someone called from the back. $47, Hatch said. Another pause. Someone coughed. "I'll take $47 in cash instead," a man near the front said, and several people laughed. Maeve kept her eyes straight ahead and her jaw set. She'd learned young that if you looked at the people laughing, you handed them something. You let them know they'd reached you. She wasn't going to do that. She fixed her gaze on a water stain on the wall behind the judge's bench that was shaped something like a running dog, and she breathed slow and even and let the sounds of the room wash past her like water past stone. "Any takers?" Hatch repeated. The silence that followed had its own particular quality. It wasn't the silence of men thinking. It was the silence of men who had already thought and were just waiting for someone else to say what they'd all decided. No one spoke. "She can cook," Clement offered, his voice thin with something she suspected was shame, though she wouldn't have bet money on it. "And she's strong as most men I've known." "Looks it," someone muttered, and the laughter came again. Maeve breathed. "I'll put in $5 to sweeten it," Clement said, and she heard his voice crack slightly on the words. Whether it was guilt or just the cold, she couldn't say. Still nothing. Hatch cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, we have a legal matter that requires resolution, Your Honor." A man in the third row stood up. Hayes Dutton, who ran the dry goods supply and had a wife at home and 3 children and apparently no shame about any of it. "I'd take her, but my wife would skin me alive." He grinned at the room and sat back down to more laughter. Maeve turned her eyes from the water stain to the ropes at her wrists. They were rough hemp, tied in the kind of knot a man uses when he's not worried about the other end being able to get loose. She'd tried working at them during the walk from her uncle's house to the courthouse, but her fingers had gone numb from the cold, and she'd only managed to tighten the thing. She thought about her mother, who had died when Maeve was 11, and what she would say about this room and these men and this particular morning. Her mother had been a small, sharp-tongued woman from County Clare, who had come to the territories as a young woman and spent the rest of her short life building something from nothing. She would have had words for this, several sets of them. Absolutely not. Maeve thought, in the voice she kept only in her head, the one that still sounded like her mother. You don't give them the satisfaction. We're wasting the morning, a man toward the back said. He sounded bored. Nobody's going to take on that kind of... He paused, choosing obligation. More laughter. Judge Hatch rapped his gavel once. Order. This is still a legal proceeding. He didn't sound like he fully believed it. And then from the back of the room, from a bench she hadn't even realized had someone sitting on it, a voice said, I'll take her. It wasn't loud. That was the first thing she noticed. It didn't need to be. It had the kind of weight that made other sounds back away from it, and the laughter stopped with a suddenness that made the room feel emptied out. She turned. He was standing in the last row, and he was, there was no other word for it, enormous. Not in the soft way some big men carried themselves, but with the density of someone who had spent years moving through the kind of terrain that didn't forgive soft. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe older, with dark hair that had grown out past caring and a beard that had followed the same philosophy. His coat was heavy canvas worn pale at the elbows and shoulders, and his boots left wet prints from the snow he'd tracked in without apparently noticing. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at her. She held his gaze. She didn't look away. And you are? Hatch said, peering over his spectacles. Gideon Blackridge. A few of the men in the room exchanged looks. One man near the middle shifted in his seat and looked at the floor. The name meant something, though Maeve couldn't say what. Mr. Blackridge? Hatch shuffled his papers. You understand the terms? Full custodial responsibility, full legal claim, debt of $47 satisfied against Mr. Callahan's creditors. I understand. He was already moving forward, working his way along the side of the room toward the front, and the men near the aisle moved their legs to let him pass without being asked twice. You're sure? Hatch said. He had the look of a man who wanted to make sure someone understood what they were buying. Gideon Blackridge stopped in front of the judge's bench, and he looked at Hatch, and whatever was in that look made the older man set his papers down and stop talking. The papers ready? Yes, they are. He signed without reading them, which should have scared her. Instead, she found herself watching his hands, large and scarred across the knuckles, moving the pen with a steadiness that surprised her. He pushed the papers back to Hatch and turned around. He pulled a folding knife from his coat pocket, and every muscle in Maeve's body went taut before she could stop it. He saw it. She was certain he saw it, but he didn't comment. He held the knife up briefly where she could see it, then reached for the rope at her wrists and cut it in 2 clean strokes. The hemp fell to the floor. He put the knife away. For a moment, he just looked at her. Up close, he was even bigger than he'd seemed from across the room, and she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes, which were a shade of gray-green she didn't have a name for. There was no triumph in his expression, no ownership. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they're trying to understand. I'm not going to tell you what to do, he said. His voice was lower up close, rough at the edges, like something that didn't get used as often as it should. I signed those papers to get you out of this room. What happens after that is up to you. He paused. I'm going back to my cabin up in the Calders. If you choose to come, follow me. Then he turned around and walked toward the door. Maeve stood in the center of the room with the rope at her feet, and the welts rising on her wrists and 12 men watching her, and she thought, this is the moment. Whatever you do right now, you do it knowing what it is. She thought about going back to Clement's house. She thought about what that meant. The cold room above the kitchen, the way he looked at her since her aunt had passed, the stack of debts he kept building on her back. She thought about the $47 she represented in his mind. She thought about whatever came next if she stayed in Harwick, where every man in this room had just made his opinion of her very clear. She looked at the door through which Gideon Blackridge had disappeared. She picked up her coat from the bench where they'd set it before tying her hands, and she put it on, and she walked out of the courthouse without speaking to anyone. But outside, the cold hit her like a flat hand. November in the Calder foothills had teeth, and it used them, and the sky was the particular white-gray that meant more snow before the day was out. She stood on the wooden steps and looked up and down the street. He was at the far end, unhitching a horse from the rail in front of what used to be the cooper's shop. The horse was a big roan with a mule's temperament written into the set of its ears, and it was pulling against the hitch even as he untied it, and he let it pull for a moment before leaning in and saying something into its ear that she couldn't hear from where she stood. The horse stopped pulling. She went down the steps. She didn't run because she wasn't running from something. She was choosing something, and those felt different in the body even if the legs moved the same way. She walked the length of the street with her chin level and her eyes forward, and she didn't look back at the courthouse because there was nothing behind her worth seeing. When she reached him, he was checking the cinch on his saddle without looking up. He had a pack mule on a lead behind the horse, loaded heavy with winter supplies. She could see traps in the bundle and what looked like a wrapped haunch of something. "I need to know one thing," she said. He looked up from the cinch. "What do you expect from me?" He thought about it. Not in the way people thought when they were deciding what to say. In the way people thought when they were actually working through an answer. She noticed that. "Help with the cabin if you're willing," he said. "I've been up there 3 winters, and it still drafts like a sieve. Other than that—" He shook his head. "I'm not good company. I spend most of my days in the hills. You'd have a lot of time to yourself." She looked at him. "That's all?" "That's all." She didn't know if she believed him entirely. She wasn't sure it was possible to believe anyone entirely after the morning she'd had. But she noticed that he'd answered her question instead of redirecting it, and that he'd looked at her while he answered instead of away, and that his voice hadn't changed register the way voices did when they were covering something. "I can't ride," she said. "I know." He nodded toward the pack mule. "She's not fast, but she won't throw you. You can ride behind the packs." "She has a name?" "Agnes." "Agnes," Maeve repeated. She looked at the mule, which looked back at her with the particular skepticism of an animal that had learned to reserve judgment. "All right." He gave her a hand up without making a thing of it, just cupped his hands and boosted her up like he did it every morning, and she settled herself behind the packs and got her balance, and that was that. He mounted the roan and turned north without ceremony. They left Harwick in the early morning with snow starting to fall, and Maeve did not look back. The trail into the Calders was not a trail so much as a set of decisions. Left here, cross there, don't follow the creek past the second deadfall. Gideon seemed to move through it the way water moved through a landscape, finding the way not by thinking about it, but by knowing, the way you knew the layout of a room in the dark. Maeve watched him from the back of the mule and tried to build a map in her head, and mostly failed. The snow came in earnest by mid-morning. Not blizzard, not yet, but committed. And the trees closed in as they climbed, first the scrubby brush of the lower hills giving way to stands of pine that got bigger and denser as the trail wound up and around and up again. The cold was different up here. Drier, cleaner. It went straight through her coat without apologizing. He stopped once to let the animals drink at a stream that was still moving despite the cold, and he came back to check the pack lashing without speaking, and she noticed he'd wedged a piece of canvas between the bundles in her legs without mentioning it. A windbreak of sorts. Small and practical, and done without asking if she wanted it. She didn't comment on it either. They stopped at midday in a spot where a massive pine had fallen and taken 2 others down with it, creating a natural windbreak in the shape of a rough triangle. He built a small fire with the economy of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Never more wood than necessary, placed to give maximum heat with minimum smoke, and he produced dried meat and hardtack and a tin cup for coffee and offered her half of all of it before touching any of it himself. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. "In the Calders," he thought. 8 years. "Alone?" "Mostly." She ate the hardtack and thought about 8 years. 8 years of those trails in all seasons. 8 years of that silence. "What made you come down today?" He looked at her across the small fire. "Needed supplies." "And when you were there—" She stopped. "Why did you do it? Step forward." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because they weren't going to, and someone had to." "That's all?" He looked at the fire. "No." She waited. "Had a dog once," he said. "Good dog. Found her in a trap somebody had set and left. Probably been there 2 days. She bit me 4 times getting her out." He paused. "Couldn't leave her there." Maeve looked at him. "You're comparing me to a dog in a trap." "I'm explaining the feeling," he said, "not the situation." She considered that. "Fair enough." He kicked snow over the fire and stood and went back to the horse without further discussion, and she climbed back onto Agnes, and they went on. By late afternoon, the trees had thinned into a long mountain meadow, gone silver-white with snow and wind, and at the far end of the meadow, set into the tree line like it had grown there, was a cabin. It was larger than she'd expected, 2 rooms from the look of it, with a stone chimney that someone had built with serious intent, and a covered porch running along the front. The logs were dark with age, and the chinking showed gaps in 2 or 3 places that she could see from across the meadow. The roof was pitched steep to shed snow and had a thick layer of it already. A lean-to stable ran off the backside, and there was a woodpile along the east wall that went up to the eaves and would have looked imposing if it weren't November in mountain country. She'd have to assess the firewood situation. The thought surprised her, the practicality of it, the way her mind had already shifted from, I am in a very uncertain situation, to that woodpile won't last past January if it's what I think it is. She wasn't sure if that was a coping mechanism or just who she'd always been, but she leaned into it. Gideon dismounted outside the lean-to and began stripping the tack off the roan with practiced efficiency. She climbed down from Agnes. Her legs were stiff from the cold and the hours of riding, and she didn't land gracefully, but she didn't fall either, which she counted as a win. And she looked at the cabin. "Can I go in?" she asked. "It's your place now, too," he said, without looking up from the buckle he was working. He said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather. She went in. The door was heavy and needed lifting slightly to close properly. Inside was a single large room, fireplace on the far wall, table and 2 chairs, a sleeping loft above accessed by a wooden ladder, a second doorway that she guessed led to a storage room. The fireplace was cold and dark. The room smelled of dried herbs and pine smoke and animal hide, and it was about 30 degrees warmer than outside by virtue of being out of the wind, which in mountain November counted as a mercy. She stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly. The table was rough-cut but solid. The chairs were handmade, mugs, not beautiful, but built to last by someone who understood that function was its own kind of beauty. There were hooks on the wall by the door, a shelf above the fireplace holding a few tin cans and a small mirror, a braided rug on the floor that had seen better decades but still had warmth in it. A set of dried herbs hung from a ceiling beam. She recognized rosemary, sage, something else she couldn't place. On a shelf beside the fireplace, 3 books stood side by side. She crossed to the fireplace and knelt and looked at it. Clean draw, she thought. Good. She found the kindling in a box beside the hearth, already split and stacked, which told her something. And she found the tinder and the flint on the mantel, and she built a fire. Not a show fire. A real fire. The kind that catches and holds, small pyramid of kindling over paper over tinder, hardwood on top once it was going. Her mother had taught her fires before she'd taught her much else. Everything else you can learn, her mother had said, but the cold will kill you before you figure it out. The fire caught on the second strike. She was feeding it the first piece of real wood when Gideon came in, and she heard him stop behind her. She didn't turn around. "I didn't know when you'd be in," she said, "so I started it." A pause. "All right," he said, in the tone of someone revising a picture they had in their head. Then he went to hang up his coat. The first 2 days were careful. That was the word for it. They moved around each other in the space like 2 people who had agreed on an armistice without spelling out the terms, finding the distance that felt workable, testing the edges without making the testing obvious. He left at first light both mornings and came back near dark. And she didn't ask where he went because she already knew. There were trap lines to set and check, and the winter animals to track before the snow got too deep. She spent those days taking the measure of the cabin the way she'd take the measure of anything she was going to have to work with. The drafts were in 3 places, below the east-facing window, along the base of the north wall, and through a gap in the chinking above the door. She found rags in the storage room and wedged them into the window gap in the door, and spent an afternoon working clay from a bucket she found on the porch into the wall gap. It wasn't a permanent fix. It would do. The woodpile was adequate but not generous. She restacked the accessible sections to shed water better and organized the kindling by size, because the chaos of it had been making her twitch since she first saw it. The food situation was more complex. His stores were mostly dried meat and corn and a sack of flour that was still good. A partial tin of coffee, salt, some dried beans. She found a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the season. Or mostly, she realized, because someone had done it in haste and left 2 parsnips and a clutch of dried herbs still in the ground. She dug them out of the half-frozen soil and added them to what she had. She made stew the second evening, working with what was there. Dried venison, beans, parsnips, the herbs she'd salvaged, salt. It wasn't beautiful. It was hot, and it was filling, and the flavor had enough depth that it wasn't just survival food. He came in from the cold, and the smell stopped him in the doorway. "Sit down," she said without turning from the pot. "It's almost ready." He sat. She brought 2 bowls and sat across from him, and they ate in the same silence they'd kept most of the trip up, but this silence felt different from the courthouse silence and the trail silence. This one had a different texture, less watchful. He finished his bowl and looked at it and then at her. That's better than anything I've made in... He stopped. 3 winters, she offered. Something shifted in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't far from it either. About that. She took the bowls to the basin and rinsed them in cold water and set them to dry. And when she turned around, he was still sitting at the table with his hands around the tin cup. I don't know what to do with this, she said. Not meaning the cabin, meaning all of it. He looked up. I don't know what to do with someone who's decent, she said. I don't have a lot of experience with it. He held her gaze. Neither do I, he said. So we're even. What? By the end of the first week, she had established something like a rhythm. He was gone most days, and she was not a woman who could sit still when there were things to be done, and there were always things to be done. She patched the second chink in the north wall and reinforced the hinge on the storage room door and found the seam in the loft floor that let cold air pour through from below and wedged it with a strip of canvas. She cut from an old pack cover. She was up in the loft one afternoon. She'd been sleeping up there, him on a bedroll below, with what she suspected was more generosity than comfort. Looking at the floor seam when she found the box. It was pushed into the corner under the eave, a plain wooden box with no latch, and she almost didn't open it. She sat with her hand on the lid for a moment, and then opened it, because she was not someone who managed well with not knowing things. Inside was a photograph, daguerreotype, in a hinged case, a woman and a young boy, both solemn in the way people were solemn in photographs back when photographs cost something. The woman was small and dark-haired and striking in the way of people who didn't know they were striking. The boy was maybe 4 or 5, with a serious expression in Gideon's jaw. She closed the case, put it back exactly where she'd found it. She climbed down and didn't say anything about it, and went back to the floor seam. But she thought about it. About the man who had come down out of these mountains for supplies and ended up in a courthouse and left with a woman he didn't know, and the box under the eave, and 8 years alone. She thought about what you carried into the mountains when you were done with something, or when something was done with you. She was beginning to understand that she was not the only person in this cabin who had left something behind. He found the patched chink when he came in on the 6th evening. He ran his hand over it the way you checked something to understand how it had been done. She watched him without watching him. He didn't say anything for a moment. That's going to need to be sealed with pitch come spring, she said. Clay won't hold through the freeze-thaw. He looked at her. I know. I know you know. She was peeling the dried beans for the next morning. I'm saying it so you know I know. This time the shift in his face was more definite, closer to actual. He turned back to his coat. The loft floor has a seam letting in cold, she said. I put canvas in it, but that's temporary too. I'll look at it. I already did. A pause. I know, he said, and she thought she heard something in his voice that might have been relief. As though someone finally seen the list of things that needed doing was less like judgment and more like company. She kept peeling beans. He went to the shelf and found the coffee and started the pot. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and the fire popped and settled, and the cabin was warm enough now that she could feel her fingertips properly. She was in the mountains with a stranger, and her entire life fit in a coat pocket, and she had $47 worth of debt attached to her name in a courthouse file. She had no idea what was coming, but the fire was good, and the roof held, and something in the room had shifted from cautious to possible. And that, Maeve Callahan thought, was something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She held on to it. Outside, the snow came down steady and serious, banking against the base of the north wall, covering the meadow, closing the world to the size of one cabin, one fire, 2 people with too much past, and an uncertain amount of future. But the fire held, and the cabin held, and slowly, one evening at a time, so did they. The snow didn't let up for 3 days after she patched the north wall chink, and by the time the sky cleared and the world outside turned that sharp, painful blue that only existed at altitude after a storm, Maeve had developed a working theory about Gideon Blackridge. He was a man who solved problems by removing himself from them. Not out of cowardice, she'd already ruled that out. It was more like he'd learned somewhere along the way that his presence created a particular kind of pressure in a room. And his solution was to be in rooms as infrequently as possible. He left at first light, and he came back at dusk, and in between he was somewhere in the mountain with his traplines and his thoughts, and whatever it was that had brought him up here 8 years ago and kept him here since. The cabin when he was gone in it had a different quality than the cabin when he was in it. Not worse. Different. like a sentence with the main verb removed. She noticed that she was noticing this, and she chose not to examine it too carefully. What she did instead was work. The storage room had become her project by the end of the first week, because it needed one. Whoever had organized it originally, she assumed Gideon, though she was starting to suspect it had been a long time since he'd thought of organization as a concept that applied to him, had done so with the logic of a man who put things down and remembered approximately where they were. Dried meat hung from rafters in various states of readiness. Trapping supplies occupied one corner in a pile that should have been sorted by function, but wasn't. A barrel of cornmeal sat beside a crate of oddly assorted hardware, hinges, nails, a hand drill, 2 lengths of chain, as though they were companions. On a high shelf, she found a bag of dried apples that turned out to be fine, a tin of lard, 4 candles, a bottle of liniment, and a small hand-stitched pouch of something that smelled like lavender, which surprised her enough that she held it for a moment before setting it carefully back where she'd found it. She reorganized the room over the course of 2 days, working in the cold because there was no way to heat the storage room and no point pretending otherwise. She hung the meat by stage of drying, tallied the grain supplies, and did rough math in her head about how far it would carry 2 people through a mountain winter, and cataloged the hardware by type. The cornmeal she moved to the main room near the fire, where the temperature was more consistent. She found a crock with a lid that would keep better than the open barrel. When she was done, she stood in the doorway of the storage room and looked at it, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing made orderly, which she'd always found more reliable than most other kinds of satisfaction, because it didn't depend on anyone else. Gideon came in that evening and looked past her into the storage room and stood very still for a moment. "I can put it back," she said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been looking for that drill for 6 months. It was under the chains." "I know where it was." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Thank you." She went back to the fire. He went into the storage room and came out a minute later with the drill and turned it over in his hands like a man checking that something he thought he'd lost was actually real. He set it on the table and looked at her. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said. "I know." She stirred the pot. "I wanted to." He sat down at the table. Outside, the post-storm wind moved through the pine tops, making the sound that she was beginning to recognize as the mountain's version of quiet. Not silence, but a background that was its own kind of calm. "That's not something I'm used to," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "What isn't?" "Someone wanting to." She turned back to the pot because she didn't have an answer for that wouldn't change the temperature of the room in ways she wasn't ready for yet. He started coming home a little earlier. She noticed it on the 9th day. The light was still pale yellow in the west when she heard his boots on the porch steps, a good half hour before dark. She didn't comment. He came in and hung up his coat and went to check something on the shelf the way men did when they needed a reason to be facing away from a room, and she set an extra cup out for coffee. On the 11th day, she found fresh-cut timber stacked against the east exterior wall when she went to bring in firewood. Not firewood. Proper lumber, milled-looking, more than she'd have expected him to haul up from anywhere. She stood and looked at it for a moment in the cold, and then went back inside. "There's lumber on the east wall," she said. He was at the table cleaning a skinning knife with a piece of cloth. "I know." "What's it for?" A pause. "Chair needs replacing, and the table's got a bad leg." She looked at the table. The leg in question had a crack running along it. She could see that now that she was looking. She'd been working around it without identifying the source of the slight wobble. "When did you have time to haul lumber up here?" "Yesterday." She did the math. He would have had to go down a significant way, locate the lumber, haul it up on the mule, and still make it back by dusk. "That's a long trip for a table leg." "It is," he agreed, and went back to the knife. She let it go. But that afternoon, while he worked outside doing something with the lumber that involved a lot of careful measuring with a piece of string, she thought about the storage room and the lumber and the way he'd said, "I've been looking for that drill for 6 months," and something began to form in the back of her mind that she didn't quite want to look at directly yet. He was building things, quiet, practical things, and he hadn't said a word about any of them. The new chair appeared on the 14th morning. It was at the table when she came down the ladder. The old one still there, and a new one beside it, larger, not enormous, not in any way that called attention to itself, just sized differently. Wider in the seat, the proportions shifted in ways that she understood immediately, and that would have taken someone careful attention to get right. She stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked at it. Then she looked at the doorway to the outside, through which he'd left an hour before. She went to the doorway and measured her arm against the frame the way she'd done the first day she was here, when she'd had to angle her shoulders to get through comfortably. She did it again now. The frame was wider, not by much, but by exactly enough. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold coming in past her and the fire at her back, and she thought, he did that without saying anything, because if he'd said anything, it would have been a different kind of thing. She went inside and closed the door. She didn't sit in the new chair right away. She made coffee, and she stood at the fire and she drank it, and she let herself feel the full weight of what it meant that someone had spent part of the night building furniture to fit her without being asked and without mentioning it. And she stayed with that feeling long enough to understand it properly before she let herself move past it. When she finally sat down in it, it fit like it had been made for her, which it had. She asked him about trapping on the 16th day, when he came in to find her attempting to cure a hide she'd found bundled in the storage room and clearly doing it wrong. "That's going to get stiff," he said from the door. "I know." She sat back on her heels and looked at the hide. "I was hoping it would stay flexible." "It won't, the way you're doing it." "Then tell me the right way." He came and knelt beside her, close enough that she could smell the outdoors on him, cold air and pine resin, and the animal smell of the trap lines, and he showed her how to work the fat into the hide in the right direction, using the heel of the hand starting from the center. His hands were twice the size of hers and moved with the ease of something done so many times it had become a kind of language. She watched carefully. She did it. "Better," he said. "Don't overpraise. I've barely started." I said better, not good. "Fair." She kept working. "What do you trap mostly?" "Beaver, this time of year. Some mink. Fisher when I can find them." He rocked back on his heels. "Martin higher up." "Do you sell to anyone specific?" "Trading post in Granville, 2 days south, or there's a buyer comes through in February." He paused. "It's not a fortune." "I didn't ask if it was a fortune." She looked at him. "I'm trying to understand how things work up here. I'm not counting your money." He held her gaze. "I know you're not." "Then why do men always think women asking about finances means—" "I didn't say that." "Your voice did." A pause. His jaw moved slightly. "I've had experience with people counting things that weren't theirs to count." She thought about the photograph in the box under the eave. The woman. The boy. She thought, I'm not the only one walking around with something old and sharp in my chest. She said, "All right, that's fair." They worked in silence for a while, her on the hide, him sharpening something at the table. And the silence was the easiest it had been, worn smooth by the days they'd put in. "Could I come?" she said. "Someday. On the lines." He stopped sharpening. "The trap lines? I'm not asking to make your job harder. She pressed on the hide. "I need to know this place. I'm living in it. I should understand what it is." He thought about it with the same honesty she'd noticed in him from the beginning. Not performing consideration, actually considering. Then, "Day after tomorrow, if the weather holds. It's a 4-hour round." "I can manage 4 hours." "I know you can," he said, in a tone that made her realize he'd never questioned it, and that she'd been ready to defend herself against something that wasn't actually coming. They went the day after tomorrow because the weather didn't hold, and then they went. She wore his spare coat over her own because the high lines were above the tree line and exposed, and it fit her like a tent, and he didn't say anything about it. Agnes came along as a pack animal for the catch, and the 4 of them, her, him, horse, mule, moved up the mountain in the early morning dark when the stars were still thick overhead, and the cold was a physical thing you walked through rather than around. She understood something about him on that trip that she hadn't fully grasped from the cabin. The mountain was where he was fluent. Down in the valleys and towns, she imagined him in Harwick, in that courthouse, surrounded by people and noise and human complication. He was translated, approximated, running half a beat off the language. Up here, moving through the pre-dawn forest with the snow creaking under their boots, and the trap lines running through his head like a story he'd memorized. He was native. He pointed out sign without being asked. The scrape of a branch where a marten had gone up. The depression in snow where a deer had bedded. The track of a fox that had crossed the trail sometime in the night. Not lecturing, just noting. The way you'd note things to someone walking with you. She asked questions. He answered them. The conversation was the most natural thing they'd done together. "How do you remember where all the sets are?" she asked, somewhere in the second hour. "Landmarks," he said. "That boulder. The way these two trees lean together. After a while, it's just—" He paused. "You don't remember it the way you remember a list. You know it the way you know a room." "Like how I knew the kitchen in the house I grew up in," she said, "even in the dark." He looked at her. "Yes, exactly like that." They found 6 sets that morning. 2 had caught, and he dealt with those quickly and without drama in the way of someone who didn't romanticize the work, but also didn't resent it. It was what it was, and what it was kept him fed and his accounts clear and the cabin standing. He reset the sets, checked the chains, moved 2 that had been in the wrong spots based on the sign he'd read. At one point, she miscalculated the depth of a snowdrift and went into her knee, and he had her out before she'd fully processed that she was down, one hand on her forearm and the other on her coat, and then she was standing again with snow packed into her boot and her dignity approximately intact. "Thanks," she said. "Ground does that here," he said. "The crust looks solid. I'll know for next time." He looked at her sideways. "There'll be a next time. If you'll have me." She pulled the snow from her boot as best she could. "I didn't do anything useful today, but I will." He started back up the trail. "You didn't get in the way." "That's the lowest possible bar. It's higher than you'd think," he said, and she heard something in it that made her believe him. Icky. Winter settled into the Calders properly in December, the way it always did. Not with a single storm, but with a shift in everything. The air taking on a quality that wasn't just cold, but absolute. The mountain closing itself off from the lower world with methodical finality. The passes became treacherous. The supply trips were done for the season. They were, for all practical purposes, alone up here until spring. She expected that to be worse than it was. Some evenings were harder than others. There were nights when the wind screamed at the roof, and the fire needed constant feeding, and the darkness outside was total. And she lay in the loft listening to it and felt the full weight of how far she was from anything she'd ever known, and what she'd left behind. Which was, she had to be honest, not much. But it was still the known world, and the known world had a pull even when it had been terrible. Those were the nights when her own thoughts were her worst company. But other evenings, most evenings, increasingly, the cabin had a quality she didn't have a word for. They would be at the table after supper, him working on something with his hands, her mending or reading from one of the 3 books on the shelf. She'd worked through 2 of them already and was pacing herself on the 3rd. And the fire would be steady, and the wind outside would be going about its own business, and the room felt sufficient, like a word that means exactly what it needs to mean and no more. He was reading one evening, and she looked up from the book she was pretending to read and watched him without concealment for the first time. The lamp threw warm light across the table, and his face was serious in the way faces went when they were thinking about something on the page, not performing thoughtfulness. He had a vertical line between his eyebrows that she'd started thinking of as his reading line, distinct from his working at something line and his watching the distance line. She'd cataloged these without intending to. "What are you reading?" she said. He turned the book so she could see the cover. History of something. She could read the spine from where she sat. The kind of book a man read because he was interested in it, not because someone thought he should be. "Any good?" "Parts of it." He set it down. "Some of it's written like the man never actually went anywhere, just read what other people wrote and dressed it up." "You can tell?" "Can you not?" He seemed genuinely curious. She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "It's in the details. Real things have the wrong details. The small true things that nobody would put in on purpose." He looked at her steadily. "That's exactly it," he said. She went back to her book. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then he said, "What did you read?" "Before." "Before when?" "Before here." She thought about Clement's house, the cold room above the kitchen, the small window. "Anything I could find." "Clement didn't keep books, but there was a lending library in town." She paused. "I used to read the same books over and over because there weren't enough new ones." "Which ones?" She told him. He nodded at some of them and shook his head at one she mentioned, and they spent 20 minutes disagreeing about a novel she was certain was brilliant, and he was certain was overwritten. And the disagreement was the easiest thing they'd done yet, because it didn't require anything from either of them except the honest opinion, which they both turned out to have plenty of. She went to bed that night thinking that she hadn't had a conversation like that in... She counted back. trying to think of the last time she'd talked about books with someone who had opinions and expressed them without worrying about whether she agreed. She couldn't find it. She hadn't realized she'd been hungry for that particular thing. She'd been hungry for so many things for so long that they'd all blurred together into a general condition she called being fine. She lay in the loft and listened to the wind and thought that she was going to have to be careful. Not because he had done anything that required caution, because she was starting to understand that she'd arrived here half-starved in ways that had nothing to do with food, and that was the kind of hunger that could make you reach for things before you'd looked at them clearly. She was going to look clearly. She was going to be deliberate about it. She was going to try. He fixed the loft floor on a Saturday in the middle of December, which she knew was a Saturday only because she'd been keeping track in the margins of the third book. She'd climbed down the ladder that morning to find him already at it, lying on the floor of the main room, looking up through the gap she'd pointed out weeks ago, a candle beside him and his jaw set in the expression he had when he was determining the scale of a problem. "I could have kept the canvas in it," she said. "It's letting cold into the sleeping loft." He got up, brushed off his shirt. "I should have dealt with it in October." "You didn't have anyone sleeping up there in October." He looked at her. Still needed fixing. He spent the morning on it, working with the care he brought to anything he decided deserved care, which, she'd noticed, was most things. He was not a man who half did. He half did himself plenty, the cutting corners of a person who didn't think their own comfort merited full effort. But things that needed to work, he worked. She brought him coffee mid-morning and sat on the ladder to drink her own. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He kept working. "You're going to regardless." "That's true." She curled her hands around the cup. "That photograph, in the box upstairs." He went still for just a moment, then kept working. "What about it?" "I'm not asking about it," she said carefully. "I'm saying I saw it. And I'm telling you I saw it so you don't wonder." A long pause. The sound of wood being fitted carefully into place. Then, "Her name was Clara." His voice was level, but she heard what was under the level. "The boy is Henry. He'd be 12 now, maybe 13. She waited. "She took him back east 3 years after we came up here. Said she couldn't stay." He set down the tool he was holding. "I don't blame her for that. He stopped, picked the tool back up. "I wasn't easy to live with." "What happened to them?" "She remarried. I got one letter, about 4 years ago. They're in Ohio." He was quiet for a moment. "He's healthy. That's what mattered." She sat on the ladder with the coffee cooling in her hands and thought about a man spending 8 years at the end of the world with a photograph in a box and a memory of a 4-year-old's face. And she thought about the chair and the widened doorway and the way he'd explained trapping to her like someone who had gone a long time without being able to teach anything to anyone. "I'm sorry," she said. Not performing it, meaning it. "It's past," he said. And then, surprising her, "I'm not sorry I stayed up here. I wasn't good for them. I needed to get some things sorted out." He paused. "I'm still working on it." She thought about what it cost a man like this to say that. "Aren't we all?" she said. He looked up at her then, from the floor, and something passed between them that she didn't try to name because naming it would have made it into a different kind of thing. It was enough that it happened. She climbed down the ladder and went to start something for lunch, and the floor above her was quiet for a few minutes before the sound of careful work started up again. Christmas came and went without either of them mentioning it, which felt like a mutual agreement reached without discussion. On the day itself, the weather was foul, and he stayed in and they played a card game she taught him, using a battered deck she'd found in the storage room with 3 missing cards. And they played with improvised substitutes and argued about the rules for 2 hours, and she won twice, and he won once, and neither of them said what day it was. On the 27th, she came down in the morning to find a small carved figure on the table. A deer, maybe 4 inches tall, made from a piece of pale wood, the grain of the wood running along the deer's body in a way that made it look like it was moving. It was not rough carved. It was deliberate and precise and beautiful in the unselfconscious way of something made to be made, not made to be admired. She picked it up, turned it in her hands. He was at the fireplace with his back to her. "I had some time," he said. She set it down carefully in the center of the table, where the light hit it. "It's good," she said. "You can put it anywhere." "I know where I want to put it." She left it on the table, in the light, and went to start the coffee, and that was that. January brought cold that she hadn't believed possible. Not the cutting December cold she'd adjusted to, but something deeper and more serious, the kind of cold that got into the base of things and squeezed. The thermometer nailed to the porch post, a mercury thing she'd found in the storage room, and hung herself. Read temperatures that made her stand and stare at it some mornings. He was out in it every day regardless. She stopped expressing concern about this because he read concern as a comment on his judgment, which she understood. She had the same reaction when people worried about her carrying things, as though the concern itself was a diminishment. She expressed it once, and when she saw his jaw set, she filed the information away and went about her business. But she started having the coffee ready when he came in. She didn't announce this or make it into anything. The coffee was ready because the coffee was ready. He noticed on the third day. He came in and poured the cup and stood at the fire with it and looked at her. She was already at the table with her book. He didn't say anything. She didn't look up. The transaction was complete. She mended his spare coat in January. She'd found it in the storage room with a seam split along the shoulder and a hole in the right elbow that had been patched with the wrong material and was going to fail again in bad weather. She used canvas from a worn-out pack cover and spent an evening on it, and she left it on the hook where she'd found it and didn't mention it. He wore it the next morning and came back that evening and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He sat down. She put a bowl in front of him. He ate and she ate, and outside the mountain wind ran its long, cold hands along the cabin walls, and found no gaps worth speaking of, because she'd been at them. And the fire gave back warmth in good measure, because she'd been at that too, and the room had become, without either of them deciding it had, without ceremony or announcement or even full acknowledgement, a home. She thought about that some nights, lying in the loft with the carved deer on the small shelf she'd made from a scrap of the lumber he'd brought up, listening to him breathe in the room below. The way a place could change from shelter to home without a single moment you could point to as the turning point. How it happened in accumulation. In bowls of stew and patched coats and cups of coffee, ready at the right time and honest arguments about books, and the specific way a man built a chair to fit someone he'd just met, saying without saying, "I see you, I see what you actually are." She had not been seen in a very long time. She was beginning to understand what it meant to be. The storm that would nearly kill them both announced itself the way the worst ones always did. Not with drama, but with a particular quality of quiet. Maeve noticed it on a Tuesday morning in the third week of January. She'd gone to the porch to check the thermometer, and the air had that stillness to it that wasn't peaceful. It was the stillness of something holding its breath. The sky to the northwest was the color of old pewter, uniform and low, pressing down on the peaks with the particular intent of a lid being fitted onto something. No wind, no bird sound. The pine trees stood completely motionless, which in mountain country meant exactly nothing good. She stood on the porch for longer than the cold warranted and looked at that sky. Inside, Gideon was already at the table studying the same northwest horizon through the window, which told her his read matched hers without either of them needing to say it. "How bad?" she said. He looked at the sky a moment more. "Bad." He stood and went to the peg by the door and started pulling on his coat. "I need to get up to the High Lines today. Bring in anything I've got set before it buries everything. Today. If not today, not until it breaks. Which could be a week." She looked out the window again. The pewter sky had taken on a slightly greenish quality at its base that she'd learned in the weeks she'd been here meant the kind of snow that came sideways. "Take Agnes. Can't get Agnes above the tree line in this kind of cold." Then at least... She stopped herself, because she'd learned where that sentence ended up, and she didn't want to have that argument today. "How long?" He was checking his pack with the efficiency of someone who'd done it in his sleep. "Back before dark." He paused with his hand on the door. "Stay inside, Maeve. Whatever you hear, whatever it does, stay inside. You don't know these high lines in storm conditions, and if you get turned around above the tree line..." He stopped. "Just stay inside." She wanted to say something sharp about being told what to do, because the instinct was there, and it was old, and it was hers. But she looked at his face, and it wasn't the face of a man issuing commands. It was the face of a man who was frightened of something specific and real. She'd seen enough versions of his face by now to know the difference. "All right," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he went out. She listened to his boots on the porch steps, and then the crunch of snow getting quieter as he moved away from the cabin, and then nothing, because that sky had eaten the sound of everything. The storm came in at noon, not gradually. It arrived with the totality of something that had been deciding for a long time and had finally made up its mind. 1 hour, the air was that unnatural still. The next, the wind hit the cabin walls with enough force that the fire in the hearth pulled sideways, and the snow came not in flakes but in sheets, driven horizontal by a wind that had a voice, a sustained, low howl that she felt as much as heard through the log walls. She fed the fire, she checked the water, she put the extra wood inside from the porch pile before it got buried, hauling it in 3 trips with her coat on, and the snow finding every gap she hadn't anticipated. By the time she'd finished, she was wet to the elbow, and her boots were soaked through, and she stood by the fire and wrung out her cuffs and listened to the storm make its intentions clear. The thermometer, the last time she'd been able to read it, had been at 20 below. In a wind like this, on the open mountain above the tree line, the cold became something different, something biological, something that didn't care how strong you were or how much you wanted to live. It just got in and did what cold did. She thought about this while she dried her sleeves by the fire, and she tried very hard not to think about where Gideon was relative to the tree line right now. By 2 in the afternoon, the light had gone strange. Not dark exactly, but diffused through the blowing snow into a gray-white that made the windows into blank rectangles, showing nothing. She couldn't see the woodpile from the east window. Visibility was maybe 15 feet. Maybe. She told herself he was already in the trees. The trees offered protection. He knew these lines. He'd done this for 8 years. By 3, she'd stopped being able to hear anything outside the wind. By 4, when the light was failing for real and he wasn't back, she went to the window and put her face close to the glass and looked out into the white nothing and felt the first real fear take hold in her chest. Not worry. Fear. The specific cold-bellied kind that knew the difference between someone being late and something being wrong. She went to the door and opened it. The wind hit her face like a slap, and the snow came into the cabin immediately, swirling into the warm air and dying. She put her arm out into the storm and couldn't see her hand past the elbow. She closed the door. Stay inside. Whatever you hear, whatever it does. She stood with her back against the door and looked at the room. The fire. The 2 chairs, his and hers, not labeled, but known. The carved deer on the shelf, the coffee pot, the coat he'd left on the peg because he had a second one now. Before dark. The light was gone. She stood there for 2 full minutes, which was longer than it sounds, doing the one thing she almost never did. Nothing. She breathed and she waited and she listened to the storm tell her everything was fine. It was just late. He knew these mountains. He was sheltering somewhere with the sense the man had always had about weather. He was fine. She almost believed it. Then she went to the storage room and got the rope. It was 100 feet of good hemp rope that she'd found coiled on the high shelf in October, and she'd used 20 feet of it for various purposes since, which left her 80 feet. She tied one end to the leg of the cast iron stove, which was not going anywhere because it weighed more than she did and was bolted to the hearthstone besides. She knotted it 3 times with the kind of knots her mother had taught her. Not pretty, but they wouldn't slip. She put on every layer she owned, which wasn't enough but was what there was. Wool undershirt, heavy flannel, her coat and his spare coat on top of it, which together were bulk without elegance but kept the wind from her core if she kept moving. She wrapped her hands in strips of canvas she cut from a scrap she'd been saving, then her gloves over that. Hat pulled down over her ears. She stuffed the front of her coat with 2 pieces of firewood for reasons she didn't fully articulate to herself, but that had something to do with her mother's voice saying, "The cold gets in through the belly first." She coiled the rope over her shoulder. She thought about leaving a note and then thought, for who? There was no one to read it. She opened the door. The wind took it from her hands and slammed it back against the exterior wall. She grabbed it and fought it closed behind her and stood on the porch with the storm going about its business all around her. And she waited for her eyes to do whatever adjusting they were going to do. The night was not complete dark. The snow itself gave off a quality of light. Not bright, but enough to see shapes if the shapes were close enough. The tree line was visible, barely, as a darker mass against the white nothing. The porch steps were covered to the 3rd step. She went down. The cold hit the exposed skin of her face with a specificity that was almost personal, like it was looking for something. She tucked her chin and set her direction by the tree line and walked. The rope played out behind her. 15 feet from the cabin, she understood what he'd meant. The wind came in gusts that had no pattern, not from one direction, but from shifting angles, and each one turned the world into nothing but white noise and white air and the ground under her boots. She could feel herself wanting to turn, to correct. To find a landmark that wasn't there because the landmarks were buried under a foot of new snow and falling fast. She used the rope. When a gust hit, she crouched and held the rope and counted. And when it passed, she stood and walked in the direction she'd been going, checked by the tension of the line behind her. It was slow. She was already cold in the deep way, not the surface cold of her face, but the internal cold that meant her body was starting to make calculations about what it could afford to keep warm and what it couldn't. She kept going. The tree line was farther than it looked. It always was, in snow. The white flattened distance and made the familiar strange, and she had to resist the pull to angle toward what looked right instead of walking straight. She counted steps instead. 1 to 100, then start again. When she got to 300, she reached the first trees and she almost laughed, not from relief, but from the particular dark humor of the fact that what she thought was 30 feet was apparently 100 yards. Under the trees, the wind dropped to something survivable. The snow still came, but it came through the canopy in a filtered way, not the wall of white that the open ground had been. She stopped, and she breathed, and she listened. She was on the trail he used, or what she thought was the trail. There was no trail visible, just the relative spacing of the trees and the memory of having walked this way twice with him, in conditions that now felt like they belonged to a different season of her life. She had the rope. She could find her way back, as long as the rope held and the stove stayed bolted and the knots held. If she got turned around beyond the rope's end in this dark, in this snow, the mathematics were not in her favor. She kept moving up. She found him 40 minutes later, or the rope ran out. She wasn't sure which came first. She heard the sound before she saw him. Not a voice, not crying out, but the sound of something trying to move that couldn't, a steady, effortful sound that had the quality of a person who had been making it for a while and was still making it on will more than hope. She moved toward the sound, and the rope went taut behind her, and she let it go slack in her hand and went the last 10 feet without it. He was on the uphill side of a massive pine that had come down sometime in the last few hours, taking the top of a younger tree with it. The larger tree, the trunk was 2 feet across if it was an inch, lay across the slope at an angle, and Gideon was below it. Not fully, not all the way. It had caught him across the lower leg, pinning him from below the knee, and he was on his side in the snow with one arm braced against the trunk trying to push it, which was not something one man was going to accomplish. He saw her and stopped pushing. She had a moment, just a moment, of looking at him and the tree and the darkness and the storm, and something very clear and very specific moved through her, which was, I'm not leaving this mountain without him. Maeve. His voice was rough, stripped down to something essential. Maeve, go back to the cabin. No. She was already moving to the tree, looking at the geometry of it. How long? How long have you been pinned? A pause. Since the wind took me when it hit. Maybe an hour. Maybe longer. His words were slightly slurred at the edges, which scared her more than anything else she'd seen tonight. An hour in this cold, unable to move, on the ground. The body gave up things in that time that it didn't always get back. My leg? I'll deal with your leg. Move your hands. What are you going to... Gideon. She looked at him directly. Move your hands. He moved them. She looked at the tree. She looked at the uphill side of it, where the root ball had pulled free of the ground when it fell, leaving a cavity and a lever point where the wood was off the earth. She looked at the angle of the trunk relative to his leg, and she looked at the stand of younger trees 10 feet uphill, and she thought about physics the way her mother had taught her to think about it, not with words, but with bodies and weight, and what moved what. She found a dead branch on the ground, maybe 6 feet long and thick as her forearm, still solid when she tested it against the trunk, not rotted through, which she'd been afraid of. She jammed it under the trunk as far up the slope from Gideon as she could, where the trunk was off the ground by a few inches at the root cavity. She looked for something to create a fulcrum and found it in a knot of root that stuck up from the cavity, roughly in the right position. She set the branch over the root knot and looked at the angle. When I lift, she said, pull yourself toward me. Don't try to stand. Just drag yourself out. It's going to need more than, don't tell me what it needs. She was already at the end of the branch. Ready? A pause. Ready. She put everything she had into the end of that branch. She'd been told her whole life, every version of every way a person could be told something, that her size was a problem. That big meant slow, meant graceless, meant not right. She'd carried that information for 23 years the way you carried a stone in a shoe. always there, always adjusting to it. But she was here in the dark and the snow, and she had 6 feet of dead pine and a fulcrum, and the man who had cut the rope off her wrists was trapped under 2 feet of solid timber, and what she had was what she had. She pushed down on that branch with every pound she'd ever been told was too much. The trunk moved. Not much. An inch? Maybe 2. But it moved. She heard him drag himself, and the sound of his coat on the snow, the grunt of a man in pain using everything he had left. And she held the branch, and she breathed, and she held it, and she heard him drag, and then, "I'm clear." She let the branch go, and the trunk dropped back with a thud she felt through her boots, and she was already at his side. He was on his back in the snow, breathing in the shallow, careful way of someone managing pain. His right leg was wrong. She could see it even in the dark, the angle at the lower leg that wasn't right, the boot packed with snow. She knelt beside him and put her hand on his chest and felt his heart, fast. But there. "Can you tell me what you feel?" she said. "Leg's broken." No hesitation. "Below the knee, I think, and I'm—" He stopped and she saw him reassemble himself from the inside out, pulling back from some edge she couldn't see the bottom of. "I'm cold, Maeve." "I know." She looked back the way she'd come. The rope? The rope was there and it led back to the cabin. 80 feet of it. He was a large man and his leg was broken, and they were in the dark on a mountain in a blizzard, and she had 80 feet of rope. She did the math, and the math was not clean. "I'm going to get you upright. We're going to use the rope." "You can't—" "Don't." She took his arm and got it over her shoulders. "When I say, you use your good leg, everything else is me." He turned his head and looked at her. His face was pale past what the cold explained, and his lips had gone dark, and he was shaking. Not the shaking of someone cold, but the shaking of someone whose body was making executive decisions. His eyes were still clear, though, still him. That mattered. "You shouldn't have come out here," he said. "I know." She got her arm around his back and braced. "On 3. What came next was not something she thought about then, or for some time afterward, because thinking about it would have meant letting herself feel the full scale of it, and she couldn't afford that yet. Later, much later, she would take it out and look at it, and it would seem impossible. She knew that even then, distantly, the way you knew the temperature on the thermometer was a real number even when it didn't correspond to anything your body could process. She got him upright. He used his good leg. She took the rest. He was 6 feet and 200 and some pounds, and his leg was broken below the knee, and she was 5 feet 8 on a good day and built like someone who had spent her life being told her build was a failing, and she got him upright in the snow in a blizzard in the dark by the simple expedient of not considering the alternative. They went back by the rope. She found it in the snow where she'd dropped it, and she wrapped it twice around her hand, and she put his arm over her shoulders, and they moved. He could not put weight on the broken leg. He hopped and dragged, and she bore the difference, and every gust of wind was a renegotiation between their combined weight and the direction they needed to go. She talked to him. Not comfort. She didn't have the energy for comfort, and he didn't need it. She talked to keep him conscious, because the slurring at the edges of his voice had gotten worse, and she'd heard enough from her aunt's long winter illness to know what that meant. "Stay with me," she said. Not once. Repeatedly. Each time the rope guided them a few more feet. "Keep moving. Stay with me." "I'm here," he said each time. Quieter each time. But there. The tree line opened into the meadow. The wind came back with both hands. She bent her head and moved and did not stop moving because stopping was the one option she had decided, somewhere on the slope above the fallen pine, was not available to her. The cabin was alight. She'd left the fire going and the windows glowed, and she aimed at them through the white dark, the way you aimed at anything that meant you were still on the right side of the night. The porch steps, the door. She got it open. The heat from the cabin hit them both at once, and she heard him exhale, a sound that had everything in it and nothing left over. And she got him across the threshold, and the door shut behind them, and the storm was outside, and they were inside, and the fire was there. She got him to the floor in front of the hearth, because she wasn't going to manage the bedroll without setting him down first. She got his wet coat off and his boots. Both of them, the broken leg boot last and carefully, and she heard the sound he made when it came free, and she set her jaw and kept going. She packed the broken leg with cloth on either side and used 2 pieces of split wood as a rough splint, binding them with strips she cut from a spare blanket, not tight enough to cut blood, tight enough to hold. She'd never set a splint. She'd watched her aunt's doctor do it once, years ago, and she remembered the principle if not the detail. She pulled the bedroll close to the fire and she got him onto it, a process that required more negotiation than she had words for. And she piled every blanket in the cabin on top of him, which was 4.5, the half being a worn piece she'd been meaning to repair. And she built the fire up to the edge of what was safe. She made water hot, and she got it into him 1 cup at a time, holding the cup because his hands were shaking too badly. She checked his face and his fingers and his feet for the hard white spots of frostbite, and found some on 2 toes of the uninjured foot and on the tip of his left ear, and she dealt with them the way she'd read about dealing with them, which was slow warming, not rubbing, not heat. She'd read that somewhere, and she hoped she was remembering right. He was conscious through all of it. That was more than she'd asked for. "You're stubborn," he said at one point, somewhere in the middle of it. "Yes," she said. She was wrapping the toes. "I told you to stay inside." "I heard you." "You didn't listen." "No." She tied off the wrap. "Do you want to have this argument right now or later?" A pause. "Later," he said. "Good." She checked the splint. "Because I'm winning it regardless." He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. The storm continued to apply itself to the exterior of the cabin with great commitment and no effect, because the cabin held, because she'd made sure it held, because that was what she did. "Maeve." His voice was low. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. Not performed gratitude, not relief talking. Something else. Something that came from the same place he kept everything important, which was deep and still and not often accessed. He looked at her the way he had across the courtroom floor 3 months ago, like he was trying to understand something he didn't have a category for yet. "Don't thank me," she said. "Rest." He closed his eyes. She sat beside him and tended the fire and listened to him breathe and listened to the storm and did not sleep. He ran a fever that night. She'd half expected it. The cold, the shock, the broken bone, all of it contributing to what the body did when it was overwhelmed. It came on around midnight and peaked somewhere before dawn, and she managed it with the only tools she had: cool cloths, water, keeping him from throwing off the blankets when the fever made him restless. He was not fully present during those hours. He said things that didn't connect to anything she could find, a name she didn't recognize, something about a creek, once a whole sentence she couldn't parse that ended with, "I should have come back sooner." She didn't respond to any of it. That felt like the right call. At some point in the deep of the night, he reached for her hand in the dark. She wasn't sure he knew he was doing it. His hand was too hot, the fever still burning through him, and she held it and she didn't move. And after a while, his breathing changed into the slower pattern of actual sleep. She held his hand and she watched the fire. Outside, the blizzard was beginning to spend itself, the way the worst ones eventually did. The howl dropped to a moan, and the moan dropped to wind, ordinary wind, the kind that was just weather and not a statement. The snow still came, but it came down, not sideways, and somewhere in the hour before dawn, the sky cleared a crack to the east and a single star showed through. She saw it from where she sat. She thought about the courtroom, the rope on her wrists and the cold and the 12 men who had looked at her the way you looked at something you were deciding wasn't worth having. She thought about the courthouse steps and the long, cold street and a man tying his mule to a hitching rail and saying nothing. Not "you'll be fine," or "don't worry," or "I know what I'm doing." Just, "If you choose to come, follow me." She thought about what she'd walked toward that day, not knowing it was what she was walking toward. She thought about the room she was sitting in now and the man whose hand she was holding and the life they'd built out of rope and firewood and honest conversation and the specific daily decision to treat each other as people worth the effort. She had come here as a debt settlement. She had come here as something no one wanted. She thought about all of it, sitting there in the firelight with the storm running down outside, and somewhere in the middle of the thinking she realized that the woman who had stood in that courthouse, back straight, eyes fixed on a water stain, refusing to let anyone see her flinch, that woman had not arrived here as a casualty. She had arrived here the same way she'd arrived everywhere, ready. She just hadn't known yet what she was ready for. Gideon slept. The fire held. Outside, the first gray light of a post-storm morning moved across the snow with the tentative quality of something that wasn't entirely sure it was welcome. She fed the fire another piece of wood, the good dense stuff she'd restacked for exactly this kind of night, and she settled back and she waited for the morning, the way she'd always waited for the things she'd decided to wait for, without letting go. The fever broke on the second morning. She knew it before he was fully awake. The quality of his breathing changed sometime in the hour before dawn, deepening from the shallow, effortful thing it had been into something slower and more settled. And when she pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, the heat that had been radiating off him all night had pulled back to something that was warm instead of burning. She sat back on her heels and let herself feel the full weight of that for exactly 1 moment, and then she went to put the coffee on, because there was nothing else useful she could do with relief except let it move through her and get back to work. He opened his eyes when she was at the fire. "Morning," she said, without turning around. A pause while he assembled himself. She heard it, the breath that was inventory, checking what hurt and how much and what that meant. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough but present, fully present, not the half-there quality of the fever hours. "How's the leg?" Another pause. "It hurts." "That's correct." She poured water into the pot. "It's going to keep hurting. I need you to not do anything stupid about that." Define stupid. Trying to stand on it, trying to check the trap lines, trying to be useful. She turned around. Any of those. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. He was still on the bedroll by the fire, the 4.5 blankets piled on him, and his face had the drawn, older look of a person who'd spent a night burning through everything they had. But his eyes were clear and tracking, and when they came to rest on her, they were entirely his own. "How long was I out?" "You were never fully out. You had a fever. You said some things." "What things?" She turned back to the fire. "Nothing worth repeating." A silence. Then, "How did you get me back?" "1 foot at a time." "Maeve." She looked at him over her shoulder. "I know what I weigh," he said, "and I know where that tree was. And I know what the storm was doing." He held her gaze. "How did you get me back?" She was quiet for a moment, then, "The rope was tied to the stove. I used it both ways." She paused. "And you helped. You used your good leg. For about the first quarter of it," he said. "After that I wasn't—" He stopped. She could see him putting it together from what he remembered and what the body remembered when the mind had been somewhere else. "I remember the porch steps," he said quietly. "I don't remember much before that." "That's all right." She brought him the coffee, crouching beside him. "You don't need to." He took the cup and held it in both hands the way she'd seen him do 100 mornings. And he looked at her, and she let him look because whatever he was working through deserved the space to get worked through. "You could have died out there," he said. "I'm aware. I told you to stay inside." "You did." She stood up. "And you were under a pine tree with a broken leg and a whiteout, so I think we can agree that the evening didn't go according to anyone's plan." She went back to the fire. "Drink your coffee." He drank his coffee. No. The days that followed had their own particular texture. Not bad, not even close to bad, in ways she hadn't fully expected, but constrained in the way that any situation was constrained when one of the two people in it couldn't walk. The blizzard had left 4 feet of new snow on top of what was already there, and the world outside the cabin had been reorganized completely. The woodpile was a ridge of white with the top logs still showing. The lean-to was buried to its eave. The trail down the mountain, not that they were going anywhere, had ceased to exist as a distinct feature of the landscape and was now just a long slope of white like everything else. She did the outside work in the early mornings before he was fully awake, because she'd found that he slept harder in the first 2 hours of light than at any other time, probably the body catching up on what the fever had taken, and those 2 hours were genuinely useful to her. She dug out the woodpile. She checked on Agnes and the roan in the lean-to, both of whom had weathered the storm in the sturdy, non-committal way of animals that had done this before and would do it again. She filled the water barrel from the clean snow at the north side of the cabin, which she was using because it was less likely to have taken any contamination from the roof runoff. She was not a nurse by nature. She didn't have the particular patience of someone who moved through a sick room with soft hands and softer voice, rearranging things and offering comfort in the practiced way. She was the other kind, the kind that checked the wound, identified the problem, and dealt with it. And she suspected that was actually what he needed more, a man who would have found the soft-voiced version excruciating. She checked the splint morning and evening. The break was not clean, she could feel that much without seeing it, but it was contained, and the swelling had stabilized by the 3rd day, which she took as a reasonable sign. He would need a proper doctor when the passes opened. She'd told him that once. He'd said, "I know." They hadn't belabored it. What she hadn't expected was the conversation. Not that they hadn't been talking before. They had, increasingly, in the evenings over books and coffee, and the argument about the novel that never quite got fully resolved. But the storm and the fever and the rope and the dark had changed something between them, and they both knew it, and they were both circling it carefully, the way you circled something that was true before you were ready to say it out loud. He started talking on the fourth day. Not about the storm, about the other thing. The thing in the box under the eave, the 8 years, what had come before. He started it himself, unprompted, while she was resoling one of her boots at the table and he was on the bedroll watching the fire. He started it the way he did most things, without preamble. I came up here because I'd made a mess of everything I touched for about 3 years running, he said. She kept working on the boot. All right, Clara. I told you her name. She came up here with me because she believed what I said about making a new start, and I believed it too, at the time. What bien? He paused. But I was angry at something I couldn't name, and I took it out on the closest things, which was her and the cabin and everything that wasn't the mountain. He was quiet for a moment. I never hit her. I need to say that because it's important. But there are ways of being with a person that aren't violence and are still damage, and I did those. She looked up. He was looking at the ceiling, not at her, and his voice was level in the way of someone who had practiced being level about something that wasn't. I understand that, she said. The ways that aren't violence. He looked at her then. She met his eyes and held them. Clement didn't hit me either, she said. Mostly it was the way he talked about me. To people. Like I wasn't in the room, like I was an arrangement he was managing. She paused. It gets in, after a while. The way water gets in. You don't see the damage until the thing it got into starts to show what it's done to the structure. He was quiet. Then, how old were you when your mother died? 11. She went back to the boot. My father had already gone by then. Clement was the only family. She paused. He wasn't cruel early on. I want to be fair about that. He needed things to be manageable, and I wasn't manageable. I was too big, too loud, too much opinion about things men were supposed to have opinions about. So he started making me smaller, piece by piece, the way you sand down something that doesn't fit. The fire settled. Outside, the post-storm cold was its own kind of quiet. The world padded and muffled under all that snow. Did it work? He said. On the outside, some of it did. She turned the boot over in her hands. On the inside, I kept everything. I was very good at keeping things on the inside. She looked at the boot, which meant I carried it all around with me and pretended it wasn't heavy. He was quiet for a long moment. I've been doing that, he said. 8 years of it. I know. It doesn't get lighter. No, she said. It just gets more familiar, which isn't the same thing. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them was all of it. The courthouse, and the rope, and the months of careful circling, and the storm, and the pine tree, and the rope again, played out differently this time. And a winter's worth of small, true things that had accumulated into something neither of them had planned. When I walked into that courthouse, he said, I hadn't been down the mountain in 3 weeks. I went for supplies, that's all. He paused. I saw you standing there, and I thought about the dog. Like I told you. I remember. That wasn't the whole truth. He looked back at the ceiling. The whole truth is that I looked at you standing there with your back straight and your eyes on the wall and 12 men deciding what you were worth, and something in my chest went. He stopped. She waited. It went like something being unlocked, he said. Not a small thing. Something that had been locked for a very long time. He shook his head slightly. I don't have a better word for it than that. She set the boot down on the table. She sat with what he'd said for a moment, holding it carefully, the way she'd held the carved deer in its first morning on the table. I followed you, she said, because I had nowhere else to go. I want to be honest about that. He nodded. But I stayed, she said, because of the chair. He looked at her. The one you built to fit me, she said, and the doorway, and the way you explained the trap lines like... She stopped and found the right words. Like you assumed I would understand them. Not like I needed things simplified. Just like I was capable, and you were talking to a capable person. She paused. I hadn't had that in a very long time, Gideon. Being talked to like I was capable. Something moved through his face that she didn't have a name for and didn't need one. He looked away for a moment and then back. You are the most capable person I have ever met, he said. and I've met a fair number of people. She looked at the boot on the table. Her eyes were doing something she didn't fully sanction, and she breathed through it, and it passed. Don't make me cry, she said. I've been awake for 3 days. Something crossed his face that was as close to a smile as anything she'd seen from him in months, and it landed differently than she expected. Softer, more private, like something he'd stopped letting happen and had recently reconsidered. You should sleep, he said. I will. She picked up the boot. After I finish this. Tiens. She slept 12 hours and woke to find him attempting to reach the water barrel from the bedroll by using a piece of firewood as an extension of his arm, which was so comprehensively the wrong approach that she stood in the ladder's bottom rung and looked at it for a full 3 seconds before saying anything. What are you doing? She said. Getting water. With a piece of firewood. It's longer than my arm. You could have called for me. He looked at her. You were asleep, Gideon. You hadn't slept in 3 days. She crossed the room and filled a cup from the barrel and brought it to him and set it in his hand, and she stood there looking at him and feeling the specific frustration of dealing with a man whose version of consideration was to do things the wrong way rather than ask for what he needed. You have a broken leg, she said. Not a broken voice. If you need something, say so. I didn't want to wake you. I'd rather be woken. She sat down in her chair. I spent 11 years in Clement's house learning not to need things because needing things made me a burden. I'm not doing that here, and I'm not going to watch you do it either. He held the cup, drank. She watched him decide something. All right, he said. I need to not be able to see the trap lines out the window. It's making me... He stopped. It's making me restless in a way I can't do much about, and that's harder than the leg. She looked at the east window, through which, on a clear day, you could see the slope where the high lines ran. She got up and hung a blanket over it without discussion. Better? He let out a breath. Yes. Thank you. That's what I'm saying. She sat back down. Just say it. He nodded slowly, in the way of a man making a genuine note of something. She believed he was. February came in quietly, which was its own kind of untrustworthy up here. The cold didn't relent, but the light changed, longer and more slanted, hitting the south-facing snow in the late afternoons with a quality that wasn't warmth yet, but was the memory of warmth, a promise the mountain was making in installments. She tracked it through the south window, the way the angle crept a few degrees each week, and found herself marking it the way she'd started marking a lot of things up here, as evidence of continuity, of the world going about its business whether or not any particular winter had been survivable. Gideon healed the way he did most things, steadily, without commentary. He was a bad patient in some ways and a better one than she'd expected in others. The bad. He pushed the leg too soon, twice, and she found him standing at the wall both times using it for support when he'd sworn he wasn't going to, and they had a version of the same argument about it that ended the same way both times, which was with her winning on points but him getting slightly more mobile use of the leg each time, which she suspected was his actual goal all along. The better. He ate what she cooked without complaint, he didn't dramatize the pain, and he found things to do with his hands that weren't putting weight on what couldn't yet bear it. He carved, mostly, working through a supply of small pieces of wood she'd found him in the storage room, producing figures that accumulated on the shelf beside the original deer with a kind of quiet industry that she found she liked having in the room. She found him looking at the photograph again one evening. He'd gotten the box down himself. She didn't ask how, and he had it open on the blanket in front of him, the daguerreotype case propped against his knee. He didn't put it away when she came down the ladder. She took that as its own kind of communication. She sat in her chair. He looked at the photograph a while longer, and then he closed the case. Henry would be 14 this spring, he said. Do you write to him? I've tried. He set the box on the floor beside him. I start letters, and I don't finish them. I don't know what I'm saying that's worth the space on the page. He looked at his hands. I wasn't there. You don't explain that away with words. You don't explain it away, she agreed. But you might explain it, which isn't the same thing. She paused. He's 14. He might be ready to hear something, even if it's not the thing that makes it right. He was quiet for a long time. You think I should write? I think you've been carrying not writing for 8 years, and it's visible on you, and it seems heavy. She looked at the case on the floor. He has a father who's still alive. That's a thing some boys don't have. What you do with that is yours to figure out. She met his eyes. I'm just saying what I see. He picked up the case again, held it, set it back on the floor. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. They sat in the kind of quiet that had become, over these months, one of their better modes. Not absence, presence in a different register. Maeve. He looked at her with the directness that still caught her sometimes, the complete lack of performance in it. I need to tell you something. She set her book down. The courthouse papers, he said. The ones I signed. He looked at his hands. They give me legal claim over you in the way that territory understands legal claim, which is... He stopped, tried again. That is not what this is. It has never been what this is, and I should have said that earlier, and I didn't because I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was undoing what I'd done. He looked up. I'm not sorry I signed them. I'd sign them again. But they should not be the thing that defines what you are here, and if you ever decide this isn't where you want to be, those papers don't mean anything. I want you to know that. She looked at him. The fire between them threw its ordinary light, and the room was warm, and Agnes stamped once in the lean-to outside, and the mountain was doing its February thing with the longer light. Gideon, she said. Yes, I know. She held his gaze. I've known that since about the second week. She paused. The chair. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw something settle in him. Not resolve, not decision, but the particular relaxation of a man who has been carrying something with the wrong muscles and has finally found the right ones. What do you want? He said, quiet, genuine. Not from obligation, not because there's nowhere else to go. What do you want? The fire crackled. She felt the question land in the place she'd been guarding most carefully, the place where she kept the things she'd learned not to want because wanting things and not getting them had been its own kind of damage. She thought about the courthouse and the rope and Clement's house, and the cold room above the kitchen, and 12 men deciding she wasn't worth the trouble of having. She thought about the chair, and the widened doorway, and the trap lines in the early morning dark, and the carved deer, and the honest argument about a book, and her hand held in the dark during a fever hour by someone who probably didn't know he was doing it. She thought about who she'd been when she walked into this cabin, and who she was now in it. I want this, she said. Not because I don't have somewhere else to go, because this is where I want to be. She let that be what it was. I want to stay. He looked at her for a long time, then stay. I intend to. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Not the way things shifted in the stories she'd read where moments arrived with trumpets. It shifted the way the light shifted in late February, incrementally and then all at once. And she felt it in the same way, without being entirely sure when exactly it had happened. The wolf pack came in the last week of February. She heard them before she saw them. The particular kind of sound that carries differently than other night sounds. Not melodic, but directional, moving through the trees to the north and coming closer. She was at the window before she was fully awake and saw them in the moonlight. 4, 5, 6 shapes moving across the upper end of the meadow, in the way of animals that had been ranging for a long time and were lean with it. She watched them and thought, they'll move on. They usually did. She heard Agnes. The mule's sound came from the lean-to, not the ordinary complaint of an animal that was cold or hungry, but the higher register of something that had identified a specific threat and was informing anyone who would listen about its feelings on the matter. The roan picked it up a second later, lower, more controlled, but the same message. She was already pulling on her coat. She had the rifle from its peg by the door before she'd fully processed that she'd decided to take it, and she checked the load the way he'd shown her twice in November. Cylinder, powder, cap, and she was at the door when she heard him behind her. Don't go out there alone. His voice was sharp. She looked back. He was sitting up on the bedroll, and she could see from the way he held himself that he'd been trying to get upright for the past 30 seconds while she was moving. His face was set in the expression she knew meant he was doing something that hurt and had decided that was acceptable. You can't walk, she said. I can stand. He had the wall, was already using it. Give me something to brace on. Gideon, I'm not sending you out there alone, he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not command. She'd have pushed back against command. Something else. Something that said, I know what I'm asking of my leg, and I've decided. She looked at him for 1 second. Then she crossed the room and got his shoulder under her arm and helped him up, and she gave him the table to lean on while she brought him his coat and she loaded the rifle properly while he got his arm into the sleeve. "I'll do the shooting," she said. "You call directions." He pulled the coat on. "All right." They went out. The pack had come around the meadow's edge and was near the lean-to by the time they got to the porch. 6 animals. Not 7. She counted quickly. And they were not running, but not retreating either, circling the lean-to wall with the alert, systematic quality of animals that had made a decision and were working through the logistics of it. The roan was kicking the back wall. Agnes had gone quiet, which was in some ways worse. Gideon's hand came to her shoulder from behind, not holding her back, just placing itself. And she understood. Direction. He moved it slightly right, and she shifted her position and understood the angle. "Lead animal," he said low. "Far left. It's not the biggest, but it's running the pattern." She found it. It was moving along the lean-to wall in a wide arc, keeping the others in her peripheral sight, using the moonlight shadow of the structure. She tracked it. "When it stops," he said. It stopped. She shot. The sound hit the mountain and came back from 3 directions, and the pack broke, not all at once, but in a cascade. The lead animal down, and the others reading that information and making their calculations. And the calculations said, "Not worth it." They went back across the upper meadow in 30 seconds, and the trees took them, and the silence came back carrying only the echo of the shot and the roan's continued objections from inside the lean-to. She stood on the porch with the rifle and watched the tree line until she was sure. Gideon's hand was still on her shoulder. She turned. He was against the doorframe, the bad leg held carefully off the porch boards, his face showing what it cost him to be upright. But he was looking at her and not at the tree line. "Good shot," he said. "You called the angle." "You held steady." He paused. "In the dark, with the pack moving." He held her gaze. "That's not nothing." She looked down at the rifle in her hands and then back at him. "Let's get you inside," she said. "You're going to pay for this with your leg tomorrow." "I know." He let her take his arm. "Worth it." She helped him back inside, and she did not say what she was thinking, which was that there had been a version of this night where she'd gone out alone and another version where she'd stayed inside. She was thinking about the particular kind of person you had to be to decide on a broken leg in the middle of the night that you were going out because someone else shouldn't have to go alone. She settled him back on the bedroll. She checked the leg. It was swollen again, not badly, and she repacked it and said nothing about it because the argument could wait until morning, and he was looking at her with an expression she'd learned to recognize as him having something to say that he wasn't sure he was going to say. "Say it," she said. He looked at her. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of the papers and not because of the winter. Because I have been looking at you for 4 months, and every time I think I know what you are, you show me something else." He paused. "And because when I was on that mountain under that tree, I wasn't thinking about the cold. I was thinking, she's going to come. She's going to come because that's who she is. And I was right." He held her gaze. "I want to build something with a person like that. If she'll have me." She sat back on her heels. She thought about every version of her life that wasn't this room in this moment. She thought about the 12 men in the courthouse and what they'd decided, and about Clement Callahan and his gambling debts and his diminishments, and about 11 years old and a mother who died and left her with only her own backbone to navigate the world with, and about all of it, adding up to this. A cabin in the high Calders on a February night with a man who'd shot out the stars of her assumptions about what she deserved, one careful, unsentimental act at a time. "Ask me again when you're not running a slight fever," she said. He blinked. Then something crossed his face that was unmistakably a laugh, surprised out of him, and she felt the sound of it rearrange something in her chest that had been arranged wrong for a very long time. "I'm not running a fever," he said. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, took it away. "No," she said. "You're not." She looked at him steadily. "Then yes," she said. "I'll have you." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she let him, because she was looking at him too, and what she saw was a man who was not fixed, not done with his damage or his grief or his complicated history, but who was here, fully and deliberately here, having decided that here was where he was going to put his weight. She'd been waiting her whole life for someone who would simply, without fanfare, put their weight down beside hers. She reached over and turned down the lamp. "Sleep," she said. "Tomorrow we check the leg properly." "Maeve." "What?" "Thank you," he said. for the rope, for the tree, for all of it. She was quiet in the dark. The fire was low and warm, and the mountain outside was doing its slow February work with the light. "You're welcome," she said. "Now sleep." He slept. She lay in the warmth of the room, not in the loft, but on the second bedroll she'd moved down weeks ago for the practical reason of being closer to the fire and the patient, and the practical reason had become the real reason, and the real reason was simply that she didn't want to be far away. The mountain held them both. The fire kept its word. Outside, the longer light of a late winter moon lay across the snow in a wide white road that ran from the tree line all the way to the horizon, going somewhere neither of them had been yet. She closed her eyes. For the first time in a very long time, she did not dream of leaving. The passes opened in the third week of March, grudgingly and in stages, the way the mountain released everything, on its own terms and not a day before. The first sign was the sound. She'd grown so accustomed to the deep winter silence that the change registered before she could name it. A different quality to the air outside, a loosening, water moving somewhere under the snow that had been locked since November. The icicles along the porch eaves started dripping in the afternoons and refreezing overnight, and the snow on the south-facing slope above the meadow pulled back in a thin dark line along the tree line, exposing the first bare ground she'd seen in 4 months. She stood on the porch one morning and breathed it and felt something in her chest answer it, a loosening that matched the mountains. Gideon came out behind her, moving with the careful gait he'd had since January. The broken leg healed enough to bear weight, but not enough to forget about. The doctor in Granville would tell them, 6 weeks later, that it had knit slightly crooked, which was what happened when a leg got set by someone who'd watched it done once and was working in a blizzard by firelight. It would always give him trouble in cold weather. He would walk with a faint hitch for the rest of his life. He never once said anything about it that sounded like complaint. "Soon," he said, looking at the same line of bare ground she was looking at. "Another week, maybe 2. He nodded. "I'll need to go down before the buyer comes through in April. Check in with the trading post." He paused. "And there's the other thing." The other thing? She'd been thinking about it too. They'd said yes to each other in February in a firelit cabin on a broken-leg February night. And yes was real, and she didn't doubt it. But yes in the world meant something different than yes in the mountain, and the world was beginning to come back online around them. "The chapel in Granville," she said, "if that's what you want." "Is it what you want?" He looked at her sideways. "I want whatever makes it official and real and done," he said. "However that happens." "Then Granville," she said. "And we tell people, or we don't. But either way, we know." She paused. "I want it to be real outside this cabin, Gideon, not just between us." He put his hand on the porch rail and looked out at the meadow going soft at the edges. "Then we'll go to Granville," he said, "when the passes are clear." The trip down took longer than it should have because of the leg and the state of the trail, which the snowmelt had turned into something that was more suggestion than path in the lower sections, the surface unpredictable underfoot. She rode Agnes and he rode the roan, and she watched him manage the uneven ground with the particular stubbornness she'd catalogued over months of close observation. Not reckless, but committed to not letting the leg run his decisions, which was both admirable and occasionally maddening in equal measure. Granville was not a large town. It had what frontier towns had: a trading post, a doctor's office, a livery, 2 saloons, a dry goods, and a small chapel at the north end of the main street that served whatever denomination showed up on a given Sunday and didn't ask too many questions about the rest. The minister was a round-faced man named Aldous Pruitt, who had been in the territory for 12 years and had developed the practical theology of someone who'd seen too much hardship to be rigid about the forms. They found him in this chapel replacing a floorboard, which seemed about right. "Getting married," Gideon said, without setup. Pruitt looked up from the floor. He looked at Gideon and then at Maeve and then back at Gideon. "When?" "Today, if you're available." Pruitt looked at his floorboard, then at them. "Give me an hour to finish this section," he said, "and I'll marry you." The ceremony was 20 minutes long and attended by Pruitt's wife, who came in from the house next door still wiping her hands on her apron, and a man named Crockett, who happened to be repairing the chapel's fence and got pulled in to witness. Pruitt read what he read and asked what he asked, and they said what they said, and when it was done, Maeve stood in the small chapel with the afternoon light coming through the 2 plain windows and thought, "That's it. That's the thing." Not the words. The words were fine, ordinary. The kind that had been said in 10,000 rooms before this one. It was the moment after, when Gideon looked at her and she looked at him, and there was nothing between them except the plain true fact of what they'd decided, and the world had been formally notified. Pruitt's wife cried, which neither of them had expected. "She does this," Pruitt said, not unkindly. "Every time." They stayed in Granville 2 nights, at the boarding house above the dry goods, which was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, just a room with a bed and a window and the sound of the town going about its evening business outside. She lay awake the first night listening to Granville, a dog, someone arguing down the street, a wagon going past late, and thought about how strange it was to hear other people again after months of only the mountain. She didn't miss the mountain yet. She missed it by the second morning. On the way back up, on the second day, she told him about the letter she'd written. "To who?" he said. "Clement?" He didn't say anything. I'm not forgiving him," she said. "I want to be clear about that. What he did is what he did, and I'm not going to wrap it in something it isn't." She paused. "But I wrote him a letter that told him I was alive and married and living in the Calders, and that he didn't need to worry about the debt because it was settled, and I was fine." She looked at the trail ahead. "I needed him to know I was fine. Not for him. For me." "Because," Gideon started. "Because," she said, "the worst thing he did wasn't the courthouse. The worst thing he did was make me believe what those men in that courtroom believed, that I wasn't worth the trouble." She kept her eyes on the trail. "And I needed him to know that was wrong, even if he never believes it, even if the letter sits in his house and he never reads it. I needed to say it out loud to someone who was there." Gideon rode beside her for a while without speaking. The trail climbed through the first section of pine, the trees still carrying snow on the north-facing branches, the south sides bare and dripping. "I wrote to Henry," he said. She looked at him. "Before we left this morning," he said. "Gave it to Pruitt to post. He said he knew how to get it east." He was looking at the trail. "I didn't explain everything. I couldn't do that in a letter. But I told him I was here and I was staying and that if he ever wanted to write back, I'd write back." He paused. "And I told him I was sorry. Not in a way that was asking for anything, just said it." She thought about him sitting at the boarding house table that morning while she was finishing her coffee, writing with the concentrated expression she associated with him, doing something he found difficult. She'd thought he was making notes about the trapline schedule. She hadn't asked. "Good," she said. "I don't know if it is." "It is," she said. "Whatever comes back or doesn't. It was the right thing to do, and you did it. That's the part you control." He nodded once, the way he nodded when he was accepting something he wasn't entirely sure he believed yet, but was willing to carry for a while and see. They rode back up into the Calders in the late afternoon light, and the mountain took them back in the way it always did, without ceremony, without welcome, simply by being what it was and letting them return to it. 1. Spring came up the mountain in sections, working its way from the meadow floor to the tree line to the higher slopes over the course of 6 weeks, and Maeve worked alongside it. The kitchen garden she'd found put to bed in November, the one that had given up 2 parsnips and some dried herb to her first week's cooking, she turned properly in April, breaking the winter crust off the soil and working in what she could find for amendment. Dried animal matter from the lean-to and the composted ash from the fireplace, and the dark soil she dug from the creek bank a 1/4 mile up the slope where the runoff deposited its silt. She planted what she had seeds for, a kitchen garden's worth of vegetables from a paper packet she'd bought in Granville, and some herbs she'd found in a dry goods tin that she wasn't entirely sure would germinate, but put in anyway on the principle that they couldn't germinate if they weren't in the ground. The herbs germinated. She knelt over those first pale green threads in the May soil and felt a satisfaction so specific and physical that she stayed there longer than her knees appreciated. He found her there one morning, still in the position. "They're up," she said. He looked at the garden. "Both of them." "All 3, she pointed. "The 3rd row is slower, but it's coming." He crouched beside her with the careful management of the leg and looked at the seedlings with the same attention he gave to animal sign in the forest. Not decorative interest, but genuine reading. "Time," he said. "And sage and something I can't identify yet." She sat back on her heels. "I think it might be lavender." He was quiet for a moment. "There was lavender," he said, "in a pouch on the high shelf. I put it up there." He stopped. She waited. "Clara planted it," he said, "the first summer. The lavender didn't make it through the first winter, and she—" He stopped again. I kept the pouch. She looked at the seedling. Thin as a hair, pale green, barely there. Well, she said, it made it through this one. He looked at her. She looked at the seedling. Neither of them said anything else about it, because there wasn't anything else to say that the seedling hadn't already said better. The trading post buyer came through in late April, a compact, weathered man named Sievert, who had been working the mountain territories for 20 years and had the manner of someone who'd learned to read people the way Gideon read animal sign, quickly and without sentiment. He looked at Maeve when Gideon introduced her, and she saw him recalibrate something, not in a rude way, just in the way of someone updating information. Heard you came down in January, Sievert said to Gideon, meaning the blizzard, meaning the leg. I did, Gideon said. Sievert looked at Maeve. She met his eyes without blinking, because she had been meeting men's eyes without blinking since she was 15, and she saw no reason to change the policy. Heard you went up after him, Sievert said. I did, she said. He nodded once, the considered nod of a man who had been out in the kind of weather she'd been out in and understood what that meant. Good winter's catch anyway, he said, and turned back to business, and that was all he said about it, which was, she thought, precisely the right amount. The transaction took an hour and left them with enough money to carry through the summer comfortably, with provision for repairs the cabin needed. She'd identified 7, and the supplies she'd calculated they'd need against next winter. She'd done the math herself, working from the inventory she'd taken in October and the rate they'd gone through things, adjusting for 2 people instead of 1 and a longer winter than either of them had planned for. She showed Gideon the numbers that evening. He looked at them for a while. You did this yourself. Is it wrong? No. He kept looking at the paper. He stopped. What? It's better than what I've been doing, he said, which from him she had learned was not a small thing to say. Then I'll keep doing it, she said. She didn't make more of it than that because making more of it would have been a different kind of diminishment, the kind that was dressed up as praise. She just took the paper back and filed it, where she was keeping the accounts. The summer was not effortless. She wanted to say that clearly, even to herself, because the story of effortless things was a lie people told and then felt ashamed against when their own lives turned out to require actual work. The summer was good, and it was also hard, and those 2 things occupied the same space without either one canceling the other. Gideon's leg gave him trouble in the cold mornings. She could tell without asking by the way he came down from the loft and the order in which he moved, favoring it in the first hour and then compensating as it warmed. She didn't comment on it. She made sure there was always something hot for him in the mornings, and she made sure the porch steps were kept clear of the ice that formed on the shaded side even in June. And she did these things the same way he had built her chair and widened the doorway, not with announcement. They had arguments, real ones, the kind where both people thought they were right and neither was entirely wrong. The first significant one was about the cabin's east wall, which she thought needed to be rebuilt before the next winter, and he thought could be managed with repair. And they were both partly right and neither fully backed down, and the compromise they reached, which was to repair it properly this summer and rebuild the following one, left both of them slightly dissatisfied in the way that honest compromises often did. The second was about money. Not how much they had, but how it got spent, and whose judgment applied to what. And she said some things that were true, but not kind. And he said some things that were measured, but still landed hard. And they went to bed without resolving it on a Thursday, in July, and woke up Friday morning, and she made coffee, and he found the board she'd been looking for to repair the step. And by noon, neither of them was angry anymore. Not because they'd talked through it, but because they'd both gone and done useful things and let the anger use itself up in the work. I should have listened better on Thursday, he said that evening. I should have said it better, she said. Both things can be true, he said. Yes, she said. They usually are. They weren't good at fighting, and they weren't bad at it either. They were 2 people who had each spent significant portions of their lives being either too much or not enough for the people they were with, and they brought that history to their disagreements the way you brought everything to everything. It didn't disappear just because you knew it was there, but they kept choosing to come back to the table, and that, she was learning, was the thing that actually mattered. Not the absence of conflict, the decision to stay in the room. A letter came from Ohio in August. Pruitt sent it up with a supply rider, folded inside another envelope addressed in the minister's handwriting with a note that said only, "Thought you'd want this promptly." It was 4 sentences. Gideon read it at the table, and she watched him do it, and watched him read it twice, and then set it down and put his hands flat on the table on either side of it and sit like that for a moment. She waited. "He wrote back," he said. "Yes. He says—" He stopped, cleared something out of his voice. "He says he got my letter, and he's glad I wrote. He says he's doing well. He says he has questions, but he doesn't know yet what they are." He looked at the letter. "He says maybe someday." She sat very still. "That's something," Gideon said. "That's—" He stopped. "That's something," she agreed. Quietly. Not making it larger than it was, because it wasn't large yet. It was 4 sentences from a 14-year-old boy to a father he barely knew, and it was the start of something that might become something or might not. And either way, it was more than nothing, which was what there had been before. He folded the letter and held it. "Are you all right?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's honest." He looked at her. Something moved through his face that she'd come to recognize as him, feeling something he hadn't given himself permission to feel yet. She got up and she put her hand on his shoulder. Not a gesture, not a performance, just her hand on his shoulder, which was where it needed to be. He put his hand over hers. They stayed like that for a while. The letter sat on the table between his hands. The fire did what the fire did. Outside, the summer evening was doing its long light thing, the sun still 3 hours from setting, the meadow gold and ordinary and completely itself. The following spring, a family came up the North Trail. She was in the garden when she heard them. A sound she'd learned to identify over 2 summers, the specific register of people moving through the lower forest with more noise than a single person or animals alone. She stood and shaded her eyes and waited, and when they came into the meadow, she saw a man, a woman, 3 children of varying heights, 2 horses loaded heavy, and the particular expression on both adults' faces of people who had been traveling a long time and were looking at what they hoped was the right place. They'd been told, apparently, that the Calders had a settled cabin. They were looking for land. Her name was Ruth Calhoun. Her husband was Daniel. They were from somewhere in the Missouri Territory that hadn't worked out, which was a description she recognized as covering a range of specific disasters that were personal and real, and didn't need to be cataloged to be understood. "We heard there was good ground up here," Ruth said. She was a few years older than Maeve, with the direct gaze of a woman who'd gotten past worrying about how she came across. "We're looking to settle. We don't want to encroach on your claim." "You're not," Maeve said. She looked at the children, who were hanging back behind their parents with the wariness of young things not sure of their reception. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you've been riding since dawn." "Since before that," Ruth said. She fed them. All 5 of them, plus what Gideon ate when he came in from the high lines at midday and found his table occupied, which he managed with the particular grace of a man who had learned over the past 2 years that his home was no longer organized around his expectations, and had mostly come to peace with that. He shook Daniel Calhoun's hand and assessed him in the few seconds of the handshake the way he assessed everything quickly and completely, and she saw him decide something. And whatever he decided must have been workable, because he sat down and ate and talked to Daniel about the land north of the meadow, which was lower and warmer and had a better water source than the cabin side. The Calhouns settled that land. By the end of the summer, the frame of their cabin was up, and Gideon had put in 3 days on the roof with Daniel, and Maeve had spent 2 days with Ruth going through what they'd need to manage a first winter, and the oldest Calhoun child, a girl named Petra, who was 11 and had the unsentimental practicality of someone who'd been treated as useful for several years, had taken to following Maeve around the garden and asking questions that were better questions than most adults asked. "Why do you plant the beans next to the corn?" Petra said one August morning. "Because the beans put something in the soil that the corn needs, and the corn gives the beans something to climb." Maeve handed her a stake. "They help each other." Petra considered this. "My ma says that's what neighbors are for." Maeve looked across the meadow to where Ruth was hanging washing on a line strung between 2 pines. "Your ma's right," she said. Petra pushed the stake into the ground. "Were you always a farmer?" "No," Maeve said. "I'm still learning." "You seem like you know what you're doing." "Most of the time I'm figuring it out while I'm doing it," Maeve said. "That's what knowing what you're doing usually looks like from the outside." Petra thought about this with the focused consideration of an 11-year-old who was collecting information about how the world worked. "Is that true for everything?" she said. Maeve thought about courtrooms and rope and blizzards and splints and 4 sentences from Ohio and a lavender seedling and the particular way a man built a chair when he wanted to say something he didn't yet know how to say out loud. "Most things worth doing," she said. "Yes." Years passed the way years did when they were full of things, not smoothly, not according to plan, but continuously. One season handing off to the next, with the mountain's particular indifference to whether you were ready. 2 more families came up the trail the following year. Then another. By the time Maeve had been in the Calders for 5 years, the meadow had 3 other cabins in sight of theirs. There was a track wide enough for a wagon where the trail had been, and the trading post at Granville had started making a regular supply run to what people in the lower valleys had started calling the Blackridge Settlement, which she found she didn't mind the sound of. She had a daughter in the 4th year. They named her Nora, after Maeve's mother, a small dark-haired child who came into the world with an opinion about everything and expressed it clearly and at volume, which Gideon bore with the equanimity of a man who had married a woman with similar tendencies and had had several years to calibrate. Nora learned to walk by hauling herself up on Agnes, who endured this with the patience of an old mule who had made her peace with the indignities of family life. A son came 2 years after that. They named him James for no particular reason except that it was a name that suited itself to a boy who, they agreed, would be whatever he turned out to be, and the name shouldn't try to do too much about it. The children were not the thing that defined her. She wanted to be honest about that, because women were always described as completed by their children, made whole, made real, and she loved Nora and James with a ferocity that surprised her with its edges. The protective rage of it, the specific terror of the first winter fever, the way they could reach into her chest and do things to it she hadn't consented to. But she had been whole before them. She'd been building herself back to whole in a courthouse when she was 23, and a man cut the rope off her wrists, and she'd been working on it ever since, and the children were part of the work, not the completion of it. Henry Blackridge wrote again when Gideon had been writing for 2 years. A longer letter this time, 5 pages in a young man's careful hand, asking the questions he'd said he didn't know yet. About the mountains, about the trapping, about why he'd come here and stayed. Gideon wrote back 10 pages and asked Maeve to read them before he sent them, which she did, and when she looked up from the last page, she said, "Send it exactly as it is." "Nothing to cut?" "Nothing." She handed it back. "You said everything true and nothing extra. That's the right ratio." Henry came to the Calders when he was 19. He stayed 2 weeks and spent most of them following Gideon on the trap lines and most of the evenings at the table talking until the fire burned low. He was tall and dark-haired and had his father's jaw and a different version of his father's stillness, more considered, less defended. He was good with Nora, who was 4 by then, and had decided he was acceptable within about 20 minutes of his arrival, which was faster than she granted most people. He was awkward with Maeve in the way of a young man who wasn't sure what she was to him, which was understandable because there wasn't a word for it exactly. She didn't try to supply one. She just fed him and talked to him about things he was interested in and let the relationship find its own shape, which it did, because most things did if you left enough room. When he left, he shook Gideon's hand, and then, after a pause that had visible texture, he hugged him. Brief, careful, a young man not practiced at it. Gideon held on for the 3 seconds it lasted with his eyes closed, and when Henry stepped back, they both looked in different directions for a moment, which was its own kind of language. He came back the next summer and the one after. It became a thing. She was 38 years old when she understood completely something she'd been working toward for 15 years. The understanding came, as most real understandings do, not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but in an ordinary moment that had accumulated enough ordinary moments behind it to suddenly mean more than itself. She was standing on the ridge above the cabin, the high ridge, the one she'd climbed for the first time 3 years after coming here, when the leg was good enough and the children were old enough to leave with Ruth Calhoun for an afternoon. She came up here sometimes alone when she needed the kind of perspective that required actual altitude. Below her, the meadow, which was green in the July warmth and wide with summer light. The cabin, with the east wall rebuilt 2 years ago properly, which had been the right call even if it had taken until the 2nd year to admit it. The garden in its late summer stage, the bean stakes visible from up here. The Calhoun cabin, and the Mercer cabin beyond it, and the smoke from the Tate place on the north side. The wagon track. The children somewhere below. She could hear Nora's voice from up here, which was not unusual because Nora's voice carried. Gideon was at the woodpile. She could see the motion of the axe even from this height, regular and unhurried, the familiar rhythm. His hair had gone gray at the temples in the past few years, and the leg meant he worked slightly differently than he used to, adapting his stance without appearing to, the way people adapted to the things that had changed in them. He didn't know she was watching. He was just doing what he did in the afternoon, which was split wood because it needed splitting, which was what had always defined him at the core, not the dramatic things, though he had done those, but the steady, unglamorous dailiness of a person who showed up and did what needed doing without requiring the doing to be witnessed. She thought about the courthouse. She thought about it the way she thought about it sometimes now, not with the charge it had carried for years, the still live wire quality of something that had hurt badly and healed imperfectly. She thought about it with the distance of 15 years and the view from a ridge and the sound of her daughter's voice in the valley below. The men in that room had decided she was worthless. They had made that determination with the complete confidence of people who were used to their determinations mattering, and they had expressed it in the way men express things they believed were facts, with a particular kind of casual certainty that didn't expect to be challenged because it never had been. They were wrong. Not wrong in a complicated way. Not wrong in the way that required unpacking or understanding or context. Just wrong. The way a measurement is wrong when the instrument is broken. What she understood, standing on that ridge at 38, was that she had spent years treating their wrongness as a problem she needed to solve, as though their determination of her worth was the original fact and her life since was the counterargument, evidence submitted against a verdict, as though she owed them a rebuttal, as though the men in that room had had the standing to make the determination in the first place. They hadn't. They had been loudest, and loudness was not authority. They had been certain, and certainty was not accuracy. They had been many, and many was not right. The people who had called her worthless had never known what she was worth because they had never looked. They had looked at the surface of her, at her size and her poverty and her uncle's gambling debts and her absence of the specific qualities that made women convenient, and they had rendered a verdict based on what they could see from a courtroom bench without looking up. That wasn't judgment. It was the thing that happened when people confused their limitations for facts. She had been 23, and she had not known yet how to hold this knowledge. She'd had to live her way into it, which had taken the shape of rope in her hands in a blizzard, and a splint built from firewood, and a kitchen garden, and a daughter who carried her name, and a boy who flew back every summer from Ohio to spend 2 weeks on a mountain with a father he was slowly, carefully, at his own pace, learning to know. It had taken all of it, and even now she couldn't say she was done. The woman who carried old things imperfectly and argued with her husband about the east wall and burned the bread sometimes and lay awake some nights still moving through the version of her life that might have gone differently. People didn't finish. That wasn't how people worked. But she knew something now. She held it with both hands without apology. She came down the ridge in the late afternoon, taking the slope at an angle to spare her knees on the steeper sections, and she came across the meadow and she could hear the children more clearly now. Nora still talking, and James's lower sound answering her. And Gideon had stopped at the woodpile and was watching her come across the grass. She walked toward him, and he waited in the way he had always waited for her. Completely, with his full attention, not doing something else while she arrived. 15 years and he still did that. She had learned not to take it for granted because the things people did consistently were easy to take for granted, and he had earned this one the same way she had, by deciding repeatedly that it was worth doing. "Good up there?" he said, when she was close enough. "Clear," she said. "You can see all the way to the south ridge." He looked at her face with the reading he'd always done, the one she'd stopped minding years ago because it came from the same place the chair had come from, the genuine interest in what she actually was. "You figured something out," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Want to say what?" She looked at the valley around them. The cabins, the garden, the wagon track, the smoke from 3 neighbors' fires. She looked at Nora and James crossing the meadow toward them, Nora running and James walking at the pace of a 6-year-old who had decided running was for people without dignity. She looked at this man who was gray at the temples and walked with a hitch, and had written 10 pages of truth to a son he'd lost and gotten 2 weeks every summer in return, and who had built her a chair 15 years ago because he'd seen her and wanted her to know it. "Nothing worth saying out loud," she said. "Some things are better kept." He nodded. He understood that. He was a man who understood kept things. Nora hit them both at once. The force of her arrival distributed between their legs in the way of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned that adults needed warning. James arrived at a measured pace and stood beside Maeve and took her hand with the matter-of-fact affection he'd had since he could walk, which she never questioned because it was simply who he was. Gideon picked Nora up, despite what it cost the leg, which was his choice to make, and she didn't say anything about it. "What's for supper?" Nora said. "Whatever you help me make," Maeve said. "I want stew." "Then come help me start the stew." She took James's hand and they walked back toward the cabin together in the late afternoon light, all 4 of them, the mountain doing its evening thing with the shadows coming long across the grass. The fire would need building and the stew would need starting, and the south pasture fence had a section that wasn't going to last the week, and there was a letter to write to Henry and the accounts to finish before the trading post rider came on Friday. The work didn't stop. The list didn't end. The days kept coming in the way days did, with requirements and frictions and the occasional grace of an evening that landed right, and the whole ordinary weight of a life that was being lived rather than survived. She had wanted, once, to be wanted, to be claimed, to be worth someone's trouble. She had stood in a courthouse and listened to a room full of men decide she wasn't, and she had held herself together by the force of not letting them see. And she had walked out after a stranger into a life she hadn't planned and couldn't have predicted. She had not known, walking across that courthouse floor, what she was walking toward. She hadn't known about the chair or the blizzard or the rope tied to the stove, about lavender seedlings and letters from Ohio, and a daughter who carried a name and a son who held her hand. She hadn't known that the person who would believe in her most completely was a man who had spent 8 years being wrong about whether he deserved anything better than the mountain. She hadn't known any of it. She had just walked forward, because what she had always been, underneath everything they'd tried to make her, was a woman who walked forward. And this, all of this, the cabin and the valley and the people in it, was simply where forward had led. She went inside and built the fire and started the stew, and the evening came down on the Calders in the particular quiet way of summer evenings at altitude, soft and wide and without urgency, and the smoke from their chimney rose into it and spread and became indistinguishable from the sky.